The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, sat quietly in her favorite chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the letter that had arrived just moments before. The royal seal was broken, and the words inside had changed everything. Prince William walked into the room, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor. He had just finished a phone call that lasted nearly an hour. His face was pale, and his usually bright blue eyes looked tired and worried. Catherine looked up at him, and without saying a word, they both knew that their lives were about to change forever. The letter contained news that no one in the royal family had expected. Queen Elizabeth II had made a decision that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. After 70 years of service, she had decided to step down from the throne. But this wasn't just about retirement. The Queen had been diagnosed with a rare condition that would require her to leave public life completely. William sat down beside his wife and took her hand. They had always known that one day he would become king, but they had imagined it would be many years in the future. Now, suddenly, that future was rushing toward them like a fast-moving train. Catherine remembered the day she first met William at university. She had been a regular girl from a middle-class family, studying art history and dreaming of a simple life. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined she would one day become a duchess, let alone a future queen. The journey from Kate Middleton to Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, had been filled with challenges, but also with incredible moments of joy and love. Their children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, were still young. George was only 10 years old, Charlotte was 8, and little Louis had just turned 5. How could they explain to their children that their lives were about to change completely? How could they help them understand that their father would soon become the King of England? William stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the gardens where his children played every day. He remembered his own childhood, how difficult it had been to grow up in the public eye. His mother, Princess Diana, had tried so hard to give him and his brother Harry a normal childhood. But the pressure of royal life had always been there. Now he was faced with the same challenge. How could he protect his children while preparing them for the enormous responsibility that would one day be theirs? George, as the eldest, would one day inherit the throne from him. The weight of this knowledge felt heavier than ever before. Catherine joined him at the window. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. The palace staff moved quietly through the halls, their faces serious as they prepared for the announcement that would change British history. William and Catherine had barely slept, spending their nights talking about what lay ahead and trying to make sense of their new reality. Catherine found herself thinking about her own family. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had always been her rock. They had supported her through every challenge, from her early days of dating William when the media attention was overwhelming, to her wedding day when she became a member of the royal family. How would this news affect them? How would it change their quiet life in Berkshire? The children sensed that something was different. George, being the oldest, asked more questions than usual. He noticed that his parents seemed worried, and that there were more serious-looking people coming to visit the palace. Charlotte, always observant, asked her mother why she looked sad. Little Louis, still too young to understand the complexity of royal life, continued playing with his toys, unaware that his world was about to change. William spent hours on the phone with his father, King Charles III. Charles had only been king for a short time himself, having waited his entire life to inherit the throne from his mother. Now suddenly, he was being asked to prepare his son for the same responsibility much earlier than anyone had planned. The conversation between father and son was difficult. Charles understood better than anyone the weight of the crown and the sacrifices it required. He remembered his own struggles, the end of his marriage to Diana, the years of criticism from the media, and the constant pressure to be perfect. He didn't want his son to go through the same pain. Catherine decided to visit her children's school to speak with their teachers. She needed to prepare them for what was coming. The headmaster, a kind man who had always respected the family's privacy, listened carefully as Catherine explained the situation. They would need to increase security around the children and prepare for increased media attention. As she drove back to the palace, Catherine thought about all the charities and causes she had been working on. Her passion for early childhood development, mental health awareness, and photography had given her a sense of purpose beyond her royal duties. Would she still be able to continue this work once William became king? Would the increased responsibilities of being queen consort leave her any time for the causes she cared about so deeply? That evening, the family sat down for dinner together, something they always tried to do despite their busy schedules. The dining room felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves knew that change was coming. William looked at his children, trying to memorize this moment of normalcy before everything changed. George was telling them about his day at school, about a science project he was working on. Charlotte was excited about a dance performance she had been practicing. Louis was more interested in playing with his food than eating it, making his siblings laugh. For a moment, William and Catherine could almost forget about the weight of the crown waiting for them. After dinner, they tucked the children into bed. This bedtime routine had always been sacred to them, a time when they could just be a normal family. Catherine read Charlotte a story while William helped Louis brush his teeth. George, getting older and more independent, read to himself but still wanted his parents to say goodnight. As they turned off the lights and closed the bedroom doors, William and Catherine stood in the hallway holding hands. Tomorrow they would begin the process of telling the children about their grandfather's decision and what it meant for their family. Tonight they wanted to hold on to these last moments of their old life. The palace around them was quiet, but they knew that outside, the world was still turning, unaware of the announcement that would come soon. In just a few days, the news would break, and their private struggle would become public. The media would analyze every word, every expression, every decision they made. Catherine squeezed William's hand and he squeezed back. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else in their marriage. They had learned to lean on each other, to find strength in their partnership, and to put their family first no matter what demands were placed on them. As they walked toward their own bedroom, they could hear the distant sound of London beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, millions of people were living their ordinary lives, unaware that their future king and queen were struggling with an extraordinary decision that would change not just their own lives, but the life of an entire nation. The morning came too quickly. William woke before dawn, his mind already racing with the tasks ahead. Today was the day they would tell the children. Today was the day they would begin preparing for a future that had suddenly become their present. Catherine was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She had been watching the sunrise, thinking about her grandmother who had passed away when Catherine was young. Her grandmother had always told her that life was full of unexpected turns, and that the secret was to face each one with grace and courage. Catherine had never imagined she would need that advice for something like this. They decided to tell each child separately, starting with George. As the future heir to the throne, he needed to understand what was happening more than his younger siblings. William knocked gently on George's bedroom door and asked if he could come in for a chat. George was getting dressed for school, his school tie hanging loosely around his neck. He looked up at his father with curious eyes. William had always been honest with his children, age-appropriately about their roles in the royal family. But this conversation would be different. William sat on the edge of George's bed and explained that Great-Granny had made an important decision. He told his son that she was tired after many years of being queen and that she needed to rest. This meant that Grandpa Charles would step down too, and that William would become king sooner than they had all expected. George listened carefully, his young face serious. He asked if this meant he couldn't go to school anymore, if he would have to live differently. William assured him that they would try to keep his life as normal as possible, but yes, some things would change. There would be more security, more cameras, and more people watching everything they did. The conversation with Charlotte was gentler. At 8 years old, she understood that her family was special, but she was more concerned with immediate things like whether she could still have sleepovers with her friends, and if she would still be able to do ballet. Catherine held her daughter close and promised that they would work hard to make sure she could still do the things she loved. Little Louis was the easiest to talk to, simply because he was too young to fully grasp what being king meant. They told him that Daddy would have a very important job, like being the boss of the whole country. Louis nodded seriously and asked if that meant Daddy would be too busy to play with him. William picked up his youngest son and promised that no job, no matter how important, would ever be more important than being his father. After breakfast, the children went to school as usual, though Catherine noticed that George seemed quieter than normal. The security detail was increased, and the teachers had been briefed about keeping the children's routine as normal as possible until the official announcement was made. William spent the morning in meetings with constitutional experts, palace advisors, and government officials. The process of transition would be complex, involving Parliament, the Church of England, and representatives from all the Commonwealth countries. There were protocols to follow, ceremonies to plan, and 1,000 details to arrange. Catherine used this time to call her parents. The conversation was emotional. Her mother cried not from sadness but from worry about what this would mean for her daughter and grandchildren. Her father, ever practical, asked what support they could provide and how they could help during this transition. The most difficult call was to William's brother, Prince Harry. The relationship between the brothers had been strained in recent years, but news like this put everything else into perspective. Harry was living in California with his wife Meghan and their children, having stepped back from royal duties. Despite their differences, he was still William's brother, and William needed him to hear this news from family, not from the media. The conversation was awkward at first. Too much had been said. Too many feelings had been hurt. But when William explained what was happening, Harry's voice softened. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight that was about to fall on his brother's shoulders. Harry had chosen to walk away from royal life because he couldn't handle the pressure. Now William would have no choice but to embrace it completely. That afternoon, Catherine took a walk through Hyde Park with her personal protection officer following at a discreet distance. She needed air, space to think, and a few moments to feel like a normal person. She watched families having picnics, children playing on swings, teenagers laughing together. Soon, her ability to do something as simple as take a walk would be even more restricted. She thought about her wedding day, how magical it had felt to marry the man she loved in Westminster Abbey, with the whole world watching. She had known then that her life would be different, but she had been young and optimistic. The reality of royal life had been both harder and more rewarding than she had expected. When she returned to the palace, she found William in his study, surrounded by papers and looking overwhelmed. She sat beside him and they went through everything together, as they always did. The guest list for the coronation, the speeches that would need to be written, the changes to their children's education and security. As evening approached, they realized that this was their last night before the announcement would be made public. Tomorrow the news would break, and their private struggle would become the subject of global conversation. Tonight they wanted to have one last family dinner as they were now, before everything changed forever. The children seemed to sense the importance of the evening. They were more affectionate than usual, hugging their parents tighter, staying closer during their bedtime routine. George asked his father if being king would make him happy. William paused, thinking about how to answer honestly. He told his son that it wasn't about being happy or sad, but about doing what was right for their country and their family. As they prepared for bed, William and Catherine stood together in their bedroom, looking out at the lights of London. Tomorrow this view would look the same, but everything else would be different. They would wake up as the future King and Queen of England, with all the responsibility and sacrifice that title carried. The announcement came at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. Palace officials had spent days preparing the statement, choosing each word carefully. Within minutes of its release, the news was everywhere. Television programs were interrupted, newspaper websites crashed from traffic, and social media exploded with reactions from around the world. William and Catherine watched the coverage from William's private office, their hands clasped tightly together. The commentators spoke about constitutional history, about the line of succession, about what this meant for the monarchy. But for William and Catherine, it was deeply personal. They were watching their private pain become public property. The children were at school when the news broke, but the palace had arranged for them to be brought home early. The school had done an excellent job of keeping the news from them until their parents could explain what was happening. When George, Charlotte, and Louis arrived back at Kensington Palace, they found reporters and cameras lining the streets outside. Charlotte pressed her face to the car window, looking at all the people with cameras. She asked why there were so many people there. The protection officer, a kind man who had been with the family for years, explained gently that people were interested in their family because of the important news that had been announced. Inside the palace, William and Catherine gathered their children in the family sitting room. They explained that the news everyone was talking about was about their family. Daddy would become king, which meant they would all have new responsibilities. The children would be given new titles, and their lives would change in ways they were still figuring out. George, trying to be mature, asked practical questions. Would they have to move? Would he still go to the same school? Would people treat him differently? William answered as honestly as he could, explaining that some things would change but that their family's love for each other would always stay the same. The days that followed were overwhelming. Letters and flowers arrived from around the world. People sent messages of support, others offered advice, and some criticized the decision. William and Catherine tried to shield the children from the negative comments, but it was impossible to hide the magnitude of public interest in their family. Catherine found herself thinking about Princess Diana often during this time. William's mother had faced similar scrutiny, similar pressure, and had struggled with the demands of royal life. Catherine had always felt a connection to Diana, even though they had never met. Now she found herself wondering what Diana would have thought about this situation, what advice she might have given. The palace staff worked around the clock to manage the transition. There were protocols dating back centuries that governed how a new monarch should be prepared. William had to meet with the Archbishop of Canterbury, with the Prime Minister, with leaders from the Commonwealth countries. Each meeting was formal, serious, and reminded him of the weight of responsibility he was about to carry. Catherine had her own set of meetings. As the future queen consort, she would need to take on new patronages, new responsibilities, and a more prominent public role. The charities she had been working with wanted to understand how her new position would affect their relationships. Some were excited about the increased attention her royal status would bring. Others worried about becoming too political. The hardest part was the loss of privacy. Photographers camped outside the children's school. Every time the family left the palace, their movements were analyzed and reported. Catherine couldn't take the children to the park without it becoming a news story. William couldn't attend a charity event without speculation about what it meant for his future reign. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of meetings and media attention, Catherine found herself crying in the bathroom. The stress was overwhelming, and she felt like she was losing pieces of herself in the process of becoming who she was expected to be. William found her there and held her while she cried, understanding exactly how she felt because he was feeling the same way. They talked that night about their fears, their doubts, and their hopes. William worried that he wasn't ready, that he would make mistakes that would harm the monarchy or the country. Catherine worried about their children, about how this pressure would affect them as they grew up. They both worried about their marriage, about whether their love could survive the intense scrutiny and responsibility they were about to face. But they also talked about their strengths. They had been through challenges before and had always supported each other. They had learned to work as a team, to share the burden of public life while protecting their private relationship. They believed in the importance of the monarchy, in the role it played in British society, and in their ability to serve with dignity and compassion. The children were adapting better than their parents had expected. George took his new status seriously, asking questions about what it meant to be a future king and how he could prepare himself. Charlotte seemed mostly concerned with whether her friends would still want to play with her. Louis, at 5 years old, was more interested in the increased security detail and whether the bodyguards would play games with him. William's relationship with his father became more important than ever during this time. King Charles had experience that William desperately needed. Despite the differences they had sometimes had, Charles proved to be a source of wisdom and support. He shared stories about his own struggles with public life, his mistakes and regrets, and the lessons he had learned over decades of royal service. The most touching moment came when Queen Elizabeth II, despite her frail health, insisted on having a private meeting with William and Catherine. She was the only person who truly understood what they were going through, having become queen herself at a young age when her father died unexpectedly. The Queen spoke to them about duty, about sacrifice, and about the privilege of serving the British people. She reminded them that the monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years because it had always been able to adapt and change while maintaining its core values. She told them that she had faith in their ability to lead the monarchy into the future. As the weeks passed, William and Catherine began to find their footing in their new reality. They developed routines that helped them manage the increased demands while still protecting their family time. They learned to navigate the media attention and to use their platform to highlight the causes they cared about. The announcement of William's future coronation brought both excitement and anxiety. Planning such an enormous event while dealing with the emotional impact of the transition was challenging, but it also gave them something concrete to focus on, a goal to work toward together. 6 months had passed since the announcement, and the coronation was only weeks away. Westminster Abbey was being prepared for the ceremony that would officially make William the King of the United Kingdom and Catherine his queen consort. The weight of tradition and history felt heavier with each passing day. Catherine stood in her dressing room, looking at the coronation gown that had been specially designed for her. It was beautiful, elegant, and unlike anything she had ever worn before. The seamstresses had worked for months on every detail, from the intricate embroidery that told the story of the Commonwealth nations to the delicate pearls that had been sewn by hand. But as she looked at the dress, Catherine felt a deep sadness. This gown represented the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another that she wasn't sure she was ready for. She thought about her wedding dress, how excited she had been to wear it, how it had represented hope and love and the beginning of her happily ever after. This dress felt different. It represented duty and sacrifice and a future full of responsibilities she was still learning to understand. William was having his own struggles with the coronation preparations. The crown that he would wear had been worn by kings for centuries. When he held it during the fitting, he could feel the weight of history in his hands. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything he was about to become, and everything he was about to give up. The children were excited about the coronation in the way that only children could be. They were fascinated by the pageantry, the carriages, the uniforms, and the ceremony. George had been practicing his role in the procession, trying to walk with the dignity expected of a future king. Charlotte was excited about her dress and the fact that she would be on television around the world. Louis was mostly excited about riding in a carriage like a prince in a fairy tale. But William and Catherine could see the confusion in their children's eyes, too. They were old enough to understand that this ceremony meant their lives would never be the same, but too young to fully grasp what that meant. George had started having nightmares about being watched all the time. Charlotte had become more clingy, wanting her mother to stay with her longer at bedtime. Louis seemed fine on the surface, but he had started asking when things would go back to normal. The night before the coronation, the family had their last private dinner before the ceremony that would change everything. The palace was full of visiting dignitaries, foreign royalty, and government officials, but for this one meal, it was just the 5 of them in their private dining room. They talked about ordinary things: George's upcoming school project, Charlotte's piano lessons, Louis's latest obsession with dinosaurs. For a few hours, they were able to pretend that tomorrow was just another day, that they weren't about to become the most watched family in the world. After dinner, William and Catherine tucked their children into bed with extra care. They knew that tomorrow night bedtime would be different. There would be more security, more protocol, more distance between their public roles and their private lives as parents. When the children were finally asleep, William and Catherine went for a walk in the palace gardens. It was a clear night, and they could see stars despite the lights of London around them. They walked hand in hand, not talking much, just trying to hold on to these last moments of their old life. Catherine broke the silence first. She told William that she was scared, not of the ceremony itself, but of what came after. She was afraid that the crown would change him, that the pressure would damage their marriage, that their children would grow up feeling isolated and different from everyone else. William stopped walking and took both of her hands in his. He told her that he was scared too. He was afraid of making mistakes, of not being the king that the country needed, of disappointing people who were counting on him. But he also told her that he couldn't imagine facing any of it without her by his side. They talked about their wedding day, about how young and optimistic they had been. They had known that their life would be public, but they hadn't really understood what that would mean day after day, year after year. Now they were older, more experienced, and more aware of the sacrifices they were making. But they also talked about the positive impact they could have. As king and queen, they would have a platform to bring attention to causes they cared about, to make real changes in people's lives, to represent their country on the world stage. They had already seen how their work with charities and social causes had made a difference. As monarchs, that impact could be even greater. The morning of the coronation dawned bright and clear. London was filled with people who had traveled from around the world to witness the historic ceremony. The streets were lined with flags and banners, and there was an atmosphere of celebration and excitement throughout the city. Inside the palace, the family was surrounded by staff, security, and protocol officers. Every moment of the day had been planned and timed precisely. There was no room for spontaneity, no chance to change their minds or take a break from the schedule. Catherine's mother came to help her get ready, just as she had on Catherine's wedding day. But this time there were tears in both their eyes. This wasn't just about a beautiful ceremony. It was about Catherine taking on a role that would define the rest of her life and the lives of her children. William spent the morning with his father and brother, putting on the ceremonial uniform that he would wear to the Abbey. Harry had flown in from California for the coronation, and despite the tension between them, he was there to support his brother on this important day. The carriage ride to Westminster Abbey was surreal. Thousands of people lined the streets waving flags and cheering. The noise was incredible, but inside the carriage, William and Catherine felt strangely isolated. They waved and smiled, but their minds were on what was waiting for them at the Abbey. Westminster Abbey was filled with dignitaries from around the world. Prime ministers, presidents, kings and queens, religious leaders, and representatives from every Commonwealth nation were there to witness the ceremony. The music, the pageantry, and the ancient words of the coronation service created an atmosphere that was both magnificent and overwhelming. When the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on William's head, Catherine felt her heart break a little. The man she had married was still there, but he was also becoming something else. A symbol, an institution, a living representation of 1,000 years of history. In that moment, she understood that they were both sacrificing parts of themselves for something larger than their own happiness. When it was her turn to be crowned queen consort, Catherine felt the weight of the smaller crown on her head and the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She looked out at the congregation and saw her children watching with wide eyes. She made a silent promise to them that no matter what her title became, she would always be their mother first. 1 year had passed since the coronation, and the reality of being king and queen had settled into William and Catherine's daily lives like a heavy blanket that never came off. The initial excitement and media frenzy had calmed down, but the constant pressure and responsibility remained. William sat in his study at Buckingham Palace, reading through the red boxes that arrived every day filled with government documents that required his attention. These boxes had been part of his grandmother's daily routine for 70 years, and now they were part of his. Each document reminded him that his decisions could affect millions of people, that his role was not ceremonial but deeply connected to the governance of the nation. Catherine had found her rhythm as queen consort, but it had come at a personal cost. Her calendar was filled with official engagements, charity events, and state functions. She had less time for the causes she was passionate about, and even less time for the simple pleasures that had once brought her joy. She missed being able to take photographs as a hobby, missed walking through art galleries without crowds following her, missed having conversations with strangers who didn't know who she was. The children had adapted to their new lives, but the changes were visible in ways that broke their parents' hearts. George, now 11, had developed a serious demeanor that seemed too old for his age. He understood that he was being watched and judged, and he felt the pressure to be perfect in everything he did. His childhood innocence was fading faster than William and Catherine had hoped. Charlotte, now 9, had become more withdrawn. She loved dancing and art, but she was always aware that people were watching her, looking for stories to tell about the young princess. She had started asking if she could have a normal life when she grew up, if she could choose a different path than the one that seemed predetermined for her. Little Louis, now 6, was the most resilient of the 3 children. He still laughed easily and played with abandon, But even he had started to understand that his family was different from other families. He asked questions that pierced his parents' hearts. Why couldn't they go to McDonald's like other families? Why did people always want to take their pictures? Why couldn't Daddy just be Daddy instead of being the king? The hardest moment came on a quiet Sunday evening in autumn. The family was having dinner together, something they treasured more than ever because it happened so rarely now. The children were talking about their friends at school, about normal childhood things like birthday parties and sleepovers. Suddenly, Charlotte looked up at her parents with tears in her eyes. She said she missed the way things used to be, when they could do things together without bodyguards and photographers. She said she missed her Mummy and Daddy being just Mummy and Daddy, not the king and queen. William felt his heart shatter. He looked at his daughter, then at his wife, then at his sons, and he realized what they had all sacrificed for duty and tradition. His children were growing up in a golden cage, and his marriage was being tested by pressures that most couples could never imagine. That night, after the children were in bed, William and Catherine had the most honest conversation they had ever had. They talked about whether they had made the right choice, whether the cost to their family was worth the service they were providing to the country. Catherine cried as she told William that she sometimes felt like she was losing herself. The woman who had fallen in love with him at university, who had dreamed of a family and a life filled with simple pleasures, seemed to be disappearing under the weight of royal protocol and public expectation. William admitted that he lay awake at night wondering if his children would ever forgive him for the childhood he had taken away from them. He worried that George would grow up resenting the throne he would inherit, that Charlotte and Louis would choose to leave royal life entirely when they were old enough, just as his brother Harry had done. They talked about Harry, about how his decision to step away from royal duties had been painful for the family, but might have been the right choice for his own happiness and that of his children. They wondered if they were being selfish by staying, by accepting the crown when they could see how it was affecting their family. But as they talked through the night, they also remembered why they had accepted this responsibility. They thought about the charities they supported, the people they met who were helped by their work, the young people who looked up to them as role models. They remembered the messages they received from around the Commonwealth, from people who found hope and stability in the monarchy. William talked about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had dedicated her entire life to service. She had made similar sacrifices, had given up personal happiness for duty, and had been respected around the world for her commitment. Catherine thought about the platform she now had to advocate for causes she believed in, how her words could bring attention to issues that mattered. They realized that their heartbreak was not a sign that they had made the wrong choice, but rather proof of how much they loved their children and each other. The fact that this sacrifice was painful didn't make it wrong. It made it meaningful. As the sun rose over London, William and Catherine made a promise to each other and to their children. They would find ways to protect their family's happiness within the constraints of their royal roles. They would be more intentional about creating private time together, more creative about giving their children normal experiences, more honest about the challenges they faced. They decided to have regular family meetings where the children could express their feelings about royal life without fear of disappointing their parents. They would plan special trips and activities that prioritized family bonding over public duties. They would work together to ensure that duty and love could coexist in their lives. The next morning, they called the children together and had an age-appropriate but honest conversation about the challenges of being a royal family. They acknowledged that it wasn't always easy or fun, but they also talked about the good they could do together. They asked for their children's help in making their life work better for everyone. George surprised them by saying that he was proud of his father for being king, even though it was hard sometimes. Charlotte said she wanted to help people like her mummy did, but she also wanted to be able to dance without people taking pictures. Louis said he just wanted to make sure they still had family movie nights. As they sat together in their private sitting room, with the autumn sun streaming through the windows and their children cuddled close, William and Catherine felt something they hadn't felt in months: hope. They were still the king and queen, still bound by duty and tradition, but they were also still a family who loved each other. The road ahead would continue to be challenging. There would be more sacrifices, more difficult choices, more moments when the weight of the crown would feel almost unbearable, but they would face it together, supporting each other and protecting their love in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. Their farewell to their old life had been complete, but in letting go of what they once were, they had discovered who they could become together. The tears that had marked their transition were not just tears of loss, but tears of transformation. They were learning that true love doesn't eliminate sacrifice. It makes sacrifice meaningful, and so they continued forward, hand in hand, crown upon their heads and love in their hearts, ready to serve their country while never forgetting that their greatest duty was to each other and to their children. Their story was no longer just their own. It belonged to history, to the nation, and to the future they were building together.